Thank you, Yeppe, and I'm delighted to be with you and Sasha and the others on this panel, and for the opportunity to share a few thoughts on what a new U.S. administration potentially could do in this area. I think before getting started, though, on what it could do, I think it's important to look at where we are across the landscape and where now President Biden was involved in when he was vice president in 2016. And I think there you look at the White House CVE summit from 2015 as sort of a central event, which elevated the whole concept of a whole of society approach to addressing the threats we're talking about, and the need to support local stakeholders, including civil society and cities, while focusing much more attention on the underlying drivers of the violence. On the international front, this summit sparked the Secretary General of the UN to develop a plan of action on PVE and sparked the emergence of a range of CVE platforms, including the Strong Cities Network, that have helped globalize and institutionalize this agenda, and thus help ensure it could withstand the inevitable shifting of political winds in Washington and other capitals. And all this allowed for more opportunities for sustained networking and collaboration among the local actors seen as critical to the agenda's enduring success. Progress here has been considerable on particularly on the programmatic and research components. That said, programming in the local CVE space is often too short in time, too few in number, too siloed in approach, too limited in innovation, and often the research isn't sufficiently informing policymakers and the programming decisions. And further on the policy dimensions of the agenda, which involve focusing more attention on the behavior of governments, whether national or local, and how they treat their citizens, particularly the most marginalized in their societies. That aspect of this agenda has largely been ignored. And during the Trump administration, authoritarian and repressive governments have been were emboldened. The political and legal space for civil society groups to push back against hate and violent extremism shrank. And on the programmatic side, although the Trump team continued to support some of the Obama-era initiatives, including the Strong Cities Network, overall US funding for local CVE efforts overseas declined dramatically, and with too much of the limited funding being diverted to support outdated approaches that emphasize ideology, religion, and counter-messaging. In the meantime, the threats have become more geographically diffuse, and the salience of local contexts and actors when dealing with threats and challenges that are increasingly locally rooted and interconnected. On the domestic side, it goes without saying that the situation is much more complicated. Over the past few years, we've seen a rise in right extremist violence in my country, including an assortment of racially and ethnically motivated groups, anti-government militias, and conspiracy theorists, culminating in the Capitol insurrection earlier this month. At the same time, my country still lacks a comprehensive framework and set of policies and programs for addressing this and other forms of extremist violence. Although the Department of Homeland Security in the last years of the Trump administration did manage to restore a version of the $10 million domestic CVE grants program to support locally led initiatives that President Obama had put in place in 2016, and then the Trump team reflexively initially cut, the US continues to lag well behind its partners in terms of available funding for and the focus of locally led initiatives. So where does this leave the Biden administration? A few recommendations here. On the international side, I think it's more straightforward because it's of course less politically sensitive and complicated. First, there's the funding piece. I think, and this is all part of doubling down on an emphasis on local solutions that we saw emerging in the last years of the Obama-Biden era. On the funding, it's to reverse the decline in funding for locally led PCV initiatives and rebalance the State Department's budget to signal strong US funding commitment to the whole of society approach that was the centerpiece of the White House CVE summit. This could involve seeking support from Congress for a $500 million State Department fund to support locally led solutions for preventing hate and extremist and other forms of violence in countries around the globe, and asking lawmakers to appropriate the $200 million in the new Prevention and Stabilization Fund created in the Global Fragility Act that was adopted by Congress 18 months ago. These resources would not only demonstrate the new administration's commitment to addressing extremism and hate at a local level, but potentially lead a surge in related investments from other governments, the private sector, and the philanthropic community. But it's not just more money that's needed, it's smarter investments. And this means the investments not only need to be smarter and the collaboration with local actors need to be deeper, with the United States creating grassroots organizations more like partners rather than project implementers. Investments need to move beyond the siloed approach that has characterized how the United States and other donors have supported locally led CV initiatives, whether by cities or civil society, that often rely on disparate funding streams to advance different but interrelated agendas, whether it's PVE, conflict prevention, addressing gender-based violence, protecting human rights, youth and women's empowerment, and peace building. These approaches need to be much more integrated and long-term in vision. The prevailing approach that I've described, which is very siloed, has led to redundant, albeit differently labeled, programs, unrealized synergies, and overlooked local needs and priorities. Smarter funding also means moving from the short-term, typically 1 to 2 year project-based funding of local NGOs to longer-term coordinated comprehensive efforts. This means not only building the long-term capacity of these organizations to serve as change makers in their communities to address a range of priorities, but more broadly influencing the ecosystem underlying violent extremism through a comprehensive, data-driven, locally owned approach. This requires scaling up programs that have already demonstrated success and reversing the trend of shrinking space for civil society in a growing number of countries. Beyond more money and smarter investments, there needs to be more emphasis on involving local actors in global conversations about addressing extremist violence, giving them seats at the global table. We know, and it's become a truism to say that it's mayors' offices and neighborhoods, local NGOs, and religious centers that are on the front lines of dealing with these challenges. But too often they're excluded from the front lines of developing the solutions at a global level. We've seen them involved more in issues of climate and refugee crises, but I think on the issue of violent extremism, we still see a very layered and segregated approach where national actors, international actors are talking about local problems with local voices too often excluded from the conversation. And this needs to change. And I think also much more attention needs to be given to strengthening cooperation, breaking down barriers to local national cooperation on these issues. Too often, national governments are excluding local governments from conversations around these issues, too limited mandates for local governments, too few resources for local governments. Yet it's clear that, again, the solutions to so many of these challenges lie at the local level. On the domestic front in the US, again, it's a much more complicated situation. But I would just urge the new administration, as I've articulated in a number of pieces over the years, that when we look at the rise in right-wing extremist violence in my country, which we've seen spiking over the last 18 months or so, I think it's important that our response doesn't simply draw from the traditional counterterrorism toolkit, which in my country is quite robust and developed. It offers a great opportunity to move towards a more comprehensive approach to the problem that embraces a whole of society vision that underscores the importance of prevention and the role of local actors, local communities, and local authorities. I think it's a great opportunity for the federal government to move beyond the controversies of quote unquote CVE that dominated the Obama-Biden administration and discussions around these issues, and to finally develop a comprehensive strategy for addressing all forms of violent extremism in my country, but prioritizing the white supremacist violence and other right-wing violence. A strategy that's informed by the diverse needs and priorities of communities across my country, underpinned by a respect for privacy and other human rights. And it should avoid a top-down dictation, but again, be more of a bottom-up approach that really allows communities across the country to provide input into a comprehensive national strategy. Also, that the administration should put in place a coordination mechanism that allows not only for a whole of federal government approach that brings in non-law enforcement actors much more robustly than ever, but allows for sustained involvement of non-federal actors such as cities and local community groups. And then on the funding piece, I think it's now really time to invest in a major way in funding grassroots programs at a level that's commensurate with the threat. For the last few years, we've talked about funding levels at $10 million or $20 million. I think it's time to add at least 2 or 3 zeros to that number. And I'm talking at least $200 million a year to support locally led prevention efforts that are designed by and led by communities and civil society and framed not around the issues of concern to Washington necessarily, but around the most pressing local threats and concerns, et cetera. And then finally, all of this has to be underpinned by a consistent and clear message from the White House and across the federal government, condemning all forms of violent extremism and committing to work with all segments of society in a transparent and rights-protecting way to prevent this violence, starting with the most affected communities. Clearly, as of yesterday, we finally have a president in the White House after 4 years who's going to be committed to this agenda, and I'm excited to see what emerges from there. But I would end with one word of caution, and that is, since 9/11, the US has been looked to, rightly or wrongly, as the global leader when it comes to dealing with these issues. The seat at the table, the leadership seat at the table in global conversations was in some cases reserved for the United States. What's happened in my country over the last 4 years, I think, really will require some rethinking in terms of the ability of the US to lead on this agenda and the credibility of the US to lead on this agenda going forward. And I think as the Biden administration looks to prioritize these issues, I think, and I expect it will, re-engage the world with a sense of humility and that a sense that the US has as much to learn from others as it has to teach. And I think with that sense of humility and with that openness to dialogue and sharing concerns about the situation in our country in terms of the rising extremist violence, I think that will create some space for the US to again emerge as a leader, but it shouldn't be taken for granted that the US is going to be able to lead in the same way it led during the Obama-Biden era. So I will close with that, and I look forward to any questions and comments.